Hello, everyone, and welcome to another eventful episode of The Lion's Den. I'm your host, Venezia Leone, and today I sat down with Seamus Ruiz-Earle, who is the founder of Carabiner Group, a RevOps-as-a-Service agency. We start by talking about Seamus's entrepreneurship journey, how after COVID, he began solving one problem and ended up building a very successful business that solved a totally different one. We talk about his experience going through a private equity acquisition, what he learned, how he prepared, and upon reflection, what decisions early on contributed to his long-term success. We also talk about the power of a good name in marketing and how having carabiners, everywhere and giving those out actually extended his brand recognition and really contributed to a lot of marketing success that they had. And lastly, we talk about where RevOps is going in the future, especially now that AI is creating and solving, different problems at the same time. It's a really great episode. You won't want to miss it, and I hope you enjoy. Hi, Seamus. Thank you so much for joining me on the Lion's Den. Excited to chat today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Cool. So you started your first company at 20, you landed on Forbes 30 under 30 at 23, and then you sold that company, by 24 for an 8-figure valuation. Take us back to being 20. What did you see that made you want to start building instead of waiting?
Well, for me, it wasn't so much a choice of seeing something as it was it being thrust upon me. I was graduating from college in 2020. At 20, and was all set to go work for a company, big consulting firm, Deloitte, when the pandemic happened. And so the COVID-19 pandemic delayed my start date by 9 months. And so I had $90K in student loan debt, 9 months, a guaranteed job at the end. And so it was really more of a crime of opportunity to set out my own shingle than anything else. And it just so happened that I picked the right thing to get started in. The traction was quick, and so the opportunity arose to do it as a full-time opportunity. But I always tell people, I was the most conservative, 9 to 5, wanting to be at a company for 25 years, make partner, retire at the same company you started at. Like that was the goal. It was only because of this perfect storm of outside variables that I felt comfortable, going out and starting my own firm.
Yeah, it's so funny. It's so many entrepreneurs that I talk to have the same story of just like, I had no idea what was happening. And then all of a sudden I was an entrepreneur. So where did you find the sort of inspiration for the topic? Like, obviously I understand that you had the opportunity and everything was laid out, but like, how did you like RevOps, you know what I mean? How did you end up there?
Yeah, so I started out doing Salesforce for investment banking when I was 17 as a job to get through the door in an investment bank. That's what I wanted to do. So I cold called a whole bunch of investment banks. Most of them said, hey, you're a kid, you can't work here yet. One of them said, hey, if you teach yourself Salesforce, we'll hire you to work in our back office. And so that was what I did. And I got into this space of understanding the way that revenue technology worked. And along the way, realized that as much as I wanted to be like successful and work with smart people, I didn't really want to be in finance. That wasn't really what it was. I just wanted good earning potential. And so I ended up pivoting to consulting after doing a whole bunch of interviewing with these banks. And, I worked full time while I was in college, working for that bank, getting the experience, understanding the ecosystem. It just so happened that I became a subject matter expert in CRM, CRM being, the foundation of what eventually ended up becoming revenue operations. And so when we started at Carabiner Group, it was really just as a Salesforce consulting firm. And over time that evolved into, being a true end-to-end revenue operations consulting firm that handled the entire tech stack, because that was what our clients asked for and what they wanted.
Okay, interesting. Because I feel like at previous companies I've worked for, we've had sort of Salesforce consultants where they come in and help us do the crazy builds that Salesforce requires. So did you find that you didn't necessarily see oh, there's a lot of competition, we're going to go in sort of a vertical integration direction? You actually just had client feedback that pushed you in that way?
Yeah, it actually ended up being almost more of a horizontal integration approach, which was saying, hey, so many of these firms are just Salesforce. They bleed blue, for lack of a better term. Every problem could be solved with Salesforce, where that's a bit of an isolating perspective when you're thinking about, hey, actually, these days it's Salesforce plus 100 different other tools. And so rather than working with one firm for Salesforce, one firm for HubSpot, one firm for NetSuite, one firm for SAP, and so on and so forth, we said, let's consolidate that all down and offer it with one customer experience. And it all started because we, a year and a half in or 2 years in was the first time we had ever lost a client because we had to partner with another firm to do the HubSpot work for that client. And their standards weren't as high as our standards. And so we ended up, being in this weird situation where we lost the client because of something that another service provider did.
Wow.
And so HubSpot was our first one. And then it kind of all expanded from there as people started asking for other services.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so interesting. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of the funding and the early stages, because I think that's always right. The hardest part for an entrepreneur is going from 0 to 1. So in your first 12 to 18 months, what was the hardest, constraint or problem that you were really facing, or maybe a couple if, you kind of remember multiple roadblocks?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the two that come to mind are client acquisition and then revenue model, right? So if we think about from a client acquisition perspective, so much of the challenge is you're moving from full capacity of you're always trying to bite off more than you can chew because you have opportunities there, to not enough client opportunity and having excess staff in order to support that are costing you dollars without generating any. And then revenue model at the same time is tied into that, where what is the type of engagement that we're taking on and how are we charging for that? We were in a position, I was in a position there. I was a bit fortunate because I could both do the work and sell the work and manage the client. And because I had just graduated from college, I didn't have living expenses, didn't have a family, didn't have a mortgage, staying at home in my childhood bedroom. All of this being relatively positive, to allow me to take every dollar that I was generating and put it back into growing the business. So I was able to hire a sales rep a lot earlier than I could have if I needed to pay myself $200,000 a year in order to cover all my living expenses, for example. But the other piece was that revenue model piece. And that was one of the things that really changed pretty early on, was rather than focusing on project after project after project, charging relatively high hourly rates, but always needing to find the next, the next client to pay me, I instead focused on a managed service model, which allowed me to charge a lower hourly rate, but over a substantially longer term. Our terms were 6 months minimum, usually a year in terms of the contract, which allowed us to spread out, instead of a 200-hour project in a month, it was a project for 20 weeks. And that allowed us to regulate the ups and downs of the market in a way that was substantially easier to allow for growth and future cash flow needs.
And was that something that you, after looking for the first couple projects and realizing, oh, I have these time periods where I'm stressed about getting that next client, or clients keep telling me my, cost per hour is too high, that you kind of just shifted into this new idea?
The funny thing is that for me, it was actually the opposite of I had too much demand because our hourly rates were so much less expensive than anybody else. So I wasn't optimizing for profit. I was optimizing for growth and for top line revenue. And so, if you try to do that on a project basis, let's say that you have 2 people working for you or 4 people working for you, you can only take on 4 projects at a time, let's say. right? One person at a time, fully committed, which means you're going to be turning away the business. But if you instead can say, actually, I'm going to commit this person on 4 projects, 25% of their time on each of them, that revenue eventually is going to come in. It's just going to come in over a slightly extended period of time. And I think overall, the top line, it's going to be, larger. And so that was what we did in order to grow. It was really more of a forcing function of how can I fit in all of the work that I've got? Well, let's extend out the time frame in which we do that work. And if people don't need it immediately, then they'll be happy to do that in exchange for a lower hourly rate.
Yeah. And in the end, you're kind of collecting the same total revenue, but from a client's perspective, they're giving it to you on a longer period of time. And so from a bookkeeping perspective, it seems like a better deal.
Yeah. And it's accrual versus accounting. I would also say that for a lot of the vendors who were in the space at the time, they were charging, let's say, $50,000 for a 1 month project and using up all of the budget from that client in the 1 month, delivering an outcome, but probably not the outcome that the client needed, and then burning that relationship forever, right? And instead, we were saying, hey, us $100,000 over the course of a year, right? So we're not getting it all up in a month. But if they actually happen to renew for a year, which spoiler alert, they did, we've turned a $50,000 spend client into a $200,000 spend client, which means on a client acquisition perspective, we don't need to find as many clients to reach higher, revenue numbers, right? Which is really where the key came in. It's because if you could get someone on a true subscription offering, they keep paying you because you're providing more value for them, versus just treating them as one bite at the apple, for a high gross margin, outcome.
Yeah. I definitely, in everything I've learned, it seems like recurring revenue is the business model that you like to see.
It is. I mean, I think it's the second best one, in my experience.
What's the best one?
Success-based pricing. So success-based pricing is the golden goose for services businesses, which is, if you remove the biggest barrier to entry, which is cost, and you say, hey, I'll do this for free, and I just want a percentage of what I save you or what I generate for you, you've removed any reason why a vendor, or why a customer won't work with you. And at that point, if you can patently do that repeatedly and control enough variables where you can guarantee an outcome, sky's the limit. Again, very hard to do, but that's the best is success-based pricing.
I'm going to change my my goals to be that now. Okay, cool. So I want to talk a little bit about RevOps and kind of what it is for our listeners who might not understand or think that RevOps is just kind of tools and management of different tickets and things like that. How do you define RevOps and maybe even RevOps as a service?
Well, RevOps, there's a lot of different definitions, but we say that the mandate of RevOps is maximizing the revenue potential of a business through the use of data, technology, people, process, all of the above. Right? Now, what does that mean in practice? Well, most revenue operations people end up being staffed or tasked with managing the proliferation of tech stack components to, allow for those growth stories. So CRM, ERP, marketing automation, so HubSpot, and Salesforce, and Oracle, and SAP, and Gong, and Forecast, and Outreach. All these tools all have to work together in a strategy, and it's the RevOps team's job to do that and to orchestrate not only the configuration of those tools, but how do they mirror against a go-to-market process. So that's all kind of the service that we ended up bringing to market, which is instead of doing a project here or a project there or so on, we put it all together and said RevOps-as-a-Service, where we'll manage that entire end-to-end tech stack for you and help you set that strategy as a part of that service offering, which was pretty differentiated in market when we brought it to bear in 21.
Yeah, I definitely have experience with using 3 of those tools that you said and trying to somehow integrate them together, and there never being a source of truth, and it always being complicated as to who's using what tool and all of that. So the need there, I feel like most people have experienced in sort of a corporate job setting.
For sure.
So you grew without a massive brand or marketing budget. Did you do any creative or unconventional go-to-market moves that actually drove traction?
Yeah, so I would say our biggest differentiator at the end was the fact that we were able to build a pretty good brand and a pretty good marketing engine. All of our business came inbound to us based off of a brand. We never really had an outbound motion that was effective. How did we do that? I think three things come to mind. One is co-opting the brands of other successful businesses and partnering with them very, very early on. And that allowed us to, shall we say, establish credibility in a way that we didn't really deserve because we were so small. So good examples are, we partnered with Pavilion, which is formerly known as Revenue Collective, which is a large sales and marketing community. We did that within a year of starting. We partnered with companies like Gong and Chili Piper really, really early on and did co-marketing with them as well. So stealing somebody else's brand, not really stealing it, but stealing the energy behind it and being able to work with them gave us validity. The second was we had really good swag, funny enough. Our company was Carabiner Group. And I always tell people now, name your company after something that you can hand to people and they'll actually keep. So in our case, I don't have one near me right now, but carabiner is the little clip you use when you climb. And ours were bright blue. And we would hand those out at conferences and at events and to people, and they would end up on key rings, on backpacks, on water bottles, to the point where even now, 5 years later, you'll see them. And they're beaten up and worn, but they're still the Carabiner Group carabiners. And so people were able to remember us for that. And that brings me to the third one, which is just we were everywhere. We got on the planes in a time when people were really doing a lot of business behind their computers and not going to places. And we, I was we were doing probably 200 flights a year to cities all over the United States, going to dinners, going to conferences, getting in front of people. And when we got in front of people, the problem we were solving was so ubiquitous, right? Oh, your CRM sucks. It doesn't connect to your tech stack. Like these were problems that in every single room, there was at least one or two people who had the problem. Mm-hmm. And, it paid off. We went from, $1 million a year in revenue in year one to 4.2 in year two or something like that. Entirely fueled by, hitting the ground game.
Wow. So was it always called the Carabiner Group, and did you create that? Okay. So what was the original origin for marketing purposes, or did that just kind of work in your favor?
No, it just kind of worked out that way. The original premise was that the original idea behind the company was actually connecting college students who had skill sets with startups who needed help, because that was what I had done. I was, providing my own services in college and saying, hey, for $20 an hour, you can have access to a certified Salesforce admin that usually would have cost you $50 or $60 an hour, if not more. And I was able to get the experience I needed, and my clients were able to get the help they needed at a budget that was affordable. And so, that was actually the idea, the Carabiner connecting the kids with the talent, with the companies that needed the talent. But pretty quickly, I realized that if I was going to pursue that path with the business, I was going to have to raise a whole bunch of funding, because you would have had to train the kids before you're able to connect them with the startups. And it didn't make sense to do that at the time, so we shifted. But it was just a happy luck that worked out with the marketing machine.
That's awesome. Have you ever heard of Venture for America?
Venture for America?
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. Because that's like I did that program, and it's a very similar thing of creating, recent grads with startups, and funding was definitely a problem. So that makes a lot of sense that you kind of saw that coming. Cool. So I think selling to private equity, at a very young age is a unique experience. What maybe surprised you most about the acquisition process? Were you fully prepared and it was easy, or, how did that whole process go?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're never prepared. I think it's impossible to be prepared for your first time. I think three things stand out now in retrospect that were interesting to me. One is how early the process starts, if you will. So you can't just, I mean, you can show up one day and decide that, hey, I want to sell my company. But in order to maximize your valuation, you need to kind of start 12 months before, you're ready to sell, because all of the extraneous expenses need to get cleaned up. You need to start maximizing for profitability instead of growth. So people really care about what's in your books. And, if you want to sell the business, you kind of got to start with 12 months of really good performance in order to maximize your valuation. So that was one thing, of just how early it starts. The second is the power dynamics at play. So, depending on the type of company you're selling and when you're selling it and how and so on, you have more power than other situations. But there is a point where you are shopping the company around, and you are shopping it to potentially 3, 5, 10 buyers. And at that point in time, you hold all the power as the seller, because, you've got the illusion of choice. You can go with any number of these different firms, however you want to do that. The point at which you sign a letter of intent with one of those firms, there is almost always a clause in there that says, at the point when you sign it and for 90 days afterwards, you're not allowed to talk to any other buyers. And you have to cease all negotiations with all those other buyers. But that is a non-binding letter of intent, meaning that is the point where the buyer is allowed to do diligence, look at all your books, do whatever they want, inside of your business. And they are allowed to change any of the terms, any of the valuations that they've provided to you without penalty. And so let's say somebody commits to buying your company for $25 million, and then they look around for a while and they decide, actually, this isn't what we thought it was. We want to offer you 15 instead. There's nothing you can really do in broad terms to protect against that, because you have no power. And so that's a really challenging situation. You can always walk away, but then you have 90 days where you can't talk to anybody about selling your business. And you've just wasted time and money on lawyers and accountants and getting your books in order and all of this stuff. So I think the power dynamic certainly surprised me. And then last but not least, I think, the evaluation criteria as to what, how you were evaluating potential, partners for the future, really is important to consider. It's not always just what the dollar value they're offering to you at, but what are the terms? Is it on an earnout? Is it on a stay bonus? Is it a certain amount of rollover equity versus, cash, et cetera, et cetera? It's not apples to oranges, which makes picking that partner that you want to go to that next step with really challenging as well.
Yeah. And what about in the reverse? Like, what did you feel like the firms were vetting on your side as a partner and like your business that you would recommend a current, entrepreneur is focused on?
In our case, we were in an interesting position because we were kind of the only ones who wanted to sell in our market sector. So what ended up happening was we ended up being very much a strategic acquisition, meaning that people weren't nearly as focused on the financials of the business or those sorts of things as they were our ability to deliver the work, and were we delivering it at a high quality, and were they getting talent that they could deploy, in the models that they needed. But there were certainly over time some people who were very focused on the financials of the business, and was it throwing off 20% EBITDA or not? And so I think there was, a balance between human capital, track record, brand, and then delivery model that ultimately the firms were looking at and trying to evaluate, and then ultimately put a dollar figure against in terms of value as well.
Yeah. But at the beginning, it was a little bit more about, like you were saying, the strategic fit than just what do your books say? Yeah. I mean, it makes sense, especially only one in the industry. So when you talk about, the decisions that you made at the beginning where, okay, it's just me and I can do a lot of work and then I'm going to hire people and all of those things. What decisions that you made early ended up having the biggest impact on the outcome of the exit? So kind of what you were just saying, brand and that stuff, but like, is it oh, I chose Carabiner and that was such a cool brand and like that was a good decision,
Yeah, I mean, we made it up as we went along is the truth of it all. Like we could tell you, I could tell you that this was, master stroke of genius, and that would be total bullshit, right? So I think, one thing is we got lucky, absolutely 100% got lucky along the way with some of the decisions we made. If I had to tack one that really stands out now, it's I hired salespeople a lot sooner than I should have, by rights. Like we put a lot of time and energy into go to market, which is something that I see neglected a lot just because people want to, maximize the money that they're bringing home, right? Which I get. Salespeople are expensive, but if I hadn't hired, an account executive who ultimately ended up becoming our CRO, who grew, helped grow the company and sell tens of millions of dollars of services, like we would still be pitting along with a 10-person team and making good money, but not having done, scaled and sold the business. So I do think it matters. What are you building for? Right? There isn't necessarily a right answer, but like the steps to building a company you can sell for $100 million are different than the steps you have for a business that you want to throw off $1 million a year in cash that grows 10% year over year, to keep up with inflation. And being very clear about what your goals are helps you to make those decisions, at the right time in the right way.
I'm very impressed by how like strategic you were able to be. Like I also graduated in 2020 and I was just like not in that headspace at that time. So it's really awesome that you were able to set those goals, kind of channel that focus, make those decisions early on. And then, like you said, kind of fly by the seat of your pants as you got different inputs and you got different outputs and turn that into a successful business.
Yeah, no, I think, let me be clear, the flying by the seat of the pants was definitely there. I just think in retrospect, right, the ability, the fact that we made that call, that I said, okay, I can handle the delivery side as long as I know there's always going to be more business coming through the door, right? I think that's the part where sometimes we overcomplicate it as business owners. We think it's going to be more complicated than it is, which is, also true, but really at the end of the day, revenue solves everything, right? So whatever business that you're running, if you can go and isolate whatever variables are going to lead you to more dollars through the door, that's 90% of the battle right there, up until you reach a certain point of scale where humans become a problem, which certainly happens.
Yeah. So as a leader, what's something that you feel like is important for entrepreneurs to embody or to practice as a leader of people and a leader of organization? What's something that you kind of live by or work by?
Well, I think there's a book that a friend of mine wrote called Kind Folks Finish First, which is a pretty good mantra, I think, in business as well in life. It's a play, of course, on the nice guys finish last sentiment. But when I talk to people, I often, I use sort of this parallel of like, who would you rather do business with, Mr. Rogers or insert,
terrible person here.
Terrible person with, but who happens to be successful at business, right? Like you can think about these people who, Steve Jobs was, an asshole or whatever. Like, which one would you rather do business with, Mr. Rogers? And like most people say, Steve Jobs. Who would you rather be your friend? And most people pick Mr. Rogers, and you're like, well, okay, why is it that we think that you can't be a nice person and someone who you want to be friends with in order to do business with that person? Mm-hmm. It's like, in actuality, most people want to do work with the people that they like hanging out with. Like that's actually how it works. And so we perpetuate this cycle of like having to be an asshole in order to be good at business. And that in my experience, that isn't how it works. So that works for both, inspiring the teams that you're working with, that works for building good companies, that works for, working with the customers. across the board, it's like if you treat people well, you will get taken advantage of. Like there are examples in my past where I can think of very clearly situations where, clients screwed me over, people internally, did poorly by me and so on. But I also can think of situations where I feel very proud of the work that we did because we were treating people well. And I'd rather have that reality than, being stingy or being, closed off from that type of work. And, making more money or something along the way.
Yeah. And I think you said a really interesting thing, which is what I extrapolated from what you said is like, there's no real proof of you're going to make more money if you treat people badly. And yes, you have examples of both kinds of leaders. Exactly. Like you have examples of both kinds of leaders. So there's just really no reason to be mean. Okay. So as we kind of wrap this up, as you look ahead 5 to 10 years, especially in a post-AI world, which still is crazy to me every day, how much ChatGPT just can do in 1 second. How do you think RevOps and like go-to-market strategy in that industry might change?
Well, there's two things that I think are going to become really important. The first is that I think the problems that are solvable now inside of business are fundamentally bigger than the problems that were previously solvable. Meaning that problems that we as leaders used to discount as just being matter of fact about our business, like this is just how it goes, are no longer unsolvable. So a good example, like a client of ours retrofits buildings, right? And specifically, they retrofit buildings built before 1950 that have a very particular type of piping inside of them and a very particular type of material that sit in a very particular type of geography. And all of these pieces of data used to live in separate data sets. And so the way they used to be able to find their customer was having a person or a team of people rather go and look at one data set, pull the list from there, go to the second data set, pull the list from there, third data set, and like go building by building and see, is this the right fit or not for our services? That problem used to have 20 people who had to go and solve it every day in order to, keep them with a good group of buildings that they could call on. Now that can be done by AI, and it can be done almost instantaneously, right? That's an AI agent's, dream, is to go through all of those different buildings, all those different data sets, and compile it. If you, as the business owner, can do that first, that's a market mover dynamic that you have unlocked the key to. And so these problems are bigger, but solvable. And that's very disruptive to businesses, particularly to businesses of scale. The second, which is what brings me to that point, is that change management in these businesses, changing the processes, changing the people, changing the technology, is really freaking hard. And it's hard in the best of times. It was hard before this AI stuff came out, but those shifts were incremental typically. Those were shifts where you were telling people, hey, press this button instead of that button, click this checkbox instead of this checkbox. There are 7 sales stages now instead of 5 sales stages. Very disruptive in that format. What we're talking about now is, hey, you don't press buttons anymore, right? You speak into your phone, right? Yeah. You don't check the boxes anymore. Your robot friend does that for you, right? Like these are fundamentally different concepts and techniques that if you have 2,000 sellers in your team, you have to really bridge that gap, hundreds of millions of revenue. Like, how do you really make that change, knowing that there are incumbents or rather startups that are coming behind the incumbents who are well positioned to make that change? You have to make that change quickly at a scale that is unprecedented. Mm-hmm. And so the change management of doing that becomes really, really important, and something that is really challenging, I think, as well for folks to manage.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like the more ease that AI brings, like the more challenges it uncovers, right? It's like it's not really this solve all problems sort of technology. I mean, it is in a lot of use cases, like you mentioned, but there's still a lot of other aspects of it that we need to figure out.
I think that's the great analogy, right? Is that if folks are at point A and they need to get to point, Z, my pen's running out. Oh, there goes we're going for the second pen. There we go. Right. How do you get between point A and point Z, right? Mm-hmm. Like that chasm, it's not so much that you can't get to point Z, right? It's not that people can't understand point Z or that they don't, understand, but because they're so fundamentally different, it's this gap between that is going to be the hard part about AI for businesses that are any larger than 10 people. And that's really where I think there's a great market opportunity now for folks who understand revenue operations in particular to really go out there and be the change makers.
Yeah. And how do I get there faster or differently or over this hill that someone else has created and all that? So
without breaking everything, right? With, if you've got $100 million in revenue today, you don't want to give that up. You don't want that to disappear because you broke something critical along the way, right? But you know that you need to get it to 500. And how do you do that in an AI world? You got to go embrace this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Seamus, it's been so wonderful to talk to you today. Really enjoyed learning all about RevOps and your journey as an entrepreneur. And yeah, thanks so much for joining the Lion's Den.
Yep, happy to be here. Thank you for having me.